University of British Columbia, Master of Educational Technology, MET. ETEC531, Curriculum Issues in Cultural and New Media Studies. Media Production, Fall 18. RTorres presents Awkward Conversations about Copyright. A review of the tensions that exist between copyright in academic or university setting and business or quote unquote real world settings. Copyright within an educational context. Copyright in the United States refers to the Copyright Act of 1976, also known as 17 United States Code, and its very origin can be enshrined all the way back to the original Constitution, which included powers to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing, for limited times, to authors and inventors exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. The Copyright Act is 370 pages, and its last major amendments were in 1998 with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA. However, other changes have also taken place in 2005, 2014, and 2018. In Canada, copyright refers to the Copyright Act of Canada of 1921. Exceptions are in Section 29. The Copyright Act of Canada is 189 pages, but in its defense, it's written in two languages, French and English, which means it really is just about 95 pages long. And surprisingly, it was last amended in June 19, 2017. Some of the main changes were a bit of a mixed bag. They included important provisions such as the requirement that copyright law should be reviewed every 5 years, but also somewhat restrictive and draconian measures like the infamous notice and notice system, which requires ISPs to send notices of infringement to possible violators. However, the amendments to the Act also expanded the scope of fair dealing, and it allowed libraries and educational institutions more unrestricted use of assets. Which brings us to the challenges of understanding copyright in the context of educational environment versus the corporate world, and the tension that it's created when the two are not aligned. Within an educational context, copyright is usually presented within the scope of fair use, or fair dealing in Canada, which are, in fact, the exceptions to copyright violations allowed under the Copyright Act. In educational institutions, the conversations about copyright often center around citations and plagiarism. That is, teaching students how to properly give credit and cite references in research papers using one of the standard citation methods, such as MLA or APA, so as to avoid taking credit for someone else's work, which is plagiarism. In an educational context, most, if not all of the activities undertaken by students when using materials such as images, music, video, text, or performances is likely going to fall under one of the exceptions to infringement, which include private study or research, criticism, review, or news reporting. And if not, it might fall under one of the exempted organization categories, which includes nonprofit educational institutions, nonprofit libraries, archives, and museums, as well as adaptations to make up for perceptual disability, like translating something into Braille. In contrast, very little conversation seems to take place regarding copyright in the context of corporate environments, where the use of assets such as images, audio clips, videos, text, and other multimedia is undertaken outside the realm of private study or education, in for-profit endeavors unlikely to fall under the fair dealing exceptions. On top of the drastic differences in the environment, and thus the legal framework that surrounds the use of materials, young professionals out of school face additional pressures to produce deliverables with fast turnarounds, or with pressures from bosses and supervisors who may not be familiar, or worse, choose to disregard the requirements imposed by copyrights within a business setting. The lack of knowledge or preparation provided to students about the use of copyright in a business setting can put inexperienced professionals in a vulnerable position, as they may knowingly or unknowingly push the boundaries of the law, or simply have no ammunition to push back on requests that border on infringement that come across their desks in the course of doing their jobs. Because within corporate settings, the conversation around copyright does not revolve around crediting or citations, but acquisitions of assets for for-profit or promotional use, and this acquisition most commonly takes the form of licensing or paying royalties to secure the use of an asset. There are many things to learn about the purchase of creative assets for commercial use, starting from the fact that license restrictions can vary across providers, formats, and jurisdictions. For example, the rules that govern text may be different than those that govern video or photographs. The terms and conditions may be different across different vendors or countries, but on the whole, there are certain rules and guidelines, or at least a basic checklist that should be on hand as a list of do's and don'ts of where to start when using assets for commercial purposes. One of the most common types of acquisition is that of stock photography, which is used in social media posts, email campaigns, online advertisements, and other digital and print collateral, usually to sell a product or service. This type of use is probably the most common type of exposure to commercial copyright that regular office workers experience. In this context, it's important to note that most online stock photography agreements include different types of categories of assets and license types. For example, there may be a standard and an extended form of the license. The standard license usually has some type of limitations or restrictions. For example, limiting a print run to 500,000 or total views on a website to stay under 1 million. There are also images that are designated for editorial or commercial use. Editorial images may only be used to accompany news reports and cannot be used to sell or promote products. Most standard licenses also restrict the redistribution of the asset, their use in templates for resale, and even the use of images in the creation of logos or trademarks. Because of these variations, it's important that students should regularly be exposed to the practice of reading licenses and terms of service contracts to understand their due diligence and ethical obligations in the workplace when it comes to copyright. At a certain point, most students will make a transition into workplace professionals. According to a report by the National Post, there are over 6,000 graduates obtaining doctorates every year in Canada. However, most of them do not spend their time writing research or reports because about 80 to 90% of PhDs in Canada work outside academia. By keeping the conversation focused solely on the exceptions of fair use and somewhat neglecting the topic of commercial copyrights and their applications, educational institutions may be presenting to students only half the picture. Although the topic is, no doubt, complex and nuanced, it should be a part of the curriculum of any institution tackling the topics of digital citizenship and media literacy.